This government meeting is brought to you by Eastworks and our local cable subscribers.
Welcome, everyone, to the Southampton Housing Authority joint presentation with the Massachusetts Housing Partnership and presenting this educational forum about housing trusts. And first of all, I want to thank everyone. I never cease to be impressed how many people have who show interest in this kind of thing in our town. And I think that's wonderful to see the folks who are showing up here. It's a great thing. So our agenda is short, but the work is long, and hopefully the knowledge is expansive. I'm going to turn it over to our MHP folks. We're going to have a presentation, some education, and there will be time for question and answer. I think it's best that we hold that to the end, if that's okay with folks. People can, if they're like me and becoming forgetful already, they can type things in the chat and we can check the chat out. Janet, you're saying no chat?
The town doesn't seem to enable their chat, so we're going to jot it down on a piece of paper so you don't forget.
Yes,
and,
that's.
Sorry about that.
Okay.
Unless anybody has any magic to activate chat. So.
Right. So I would say without further delay, I'll turn it over to our folks our friends at MHP, and we'll proceed. Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for having us here. Thank you, Jim, for helping to facilitate this. And I wanted to acknowledge my colleague, Emma. We are both at MHP, Mass Housing Partnership, and we are both in the community assistance team. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here. Can you tell me if you can see the slides appropriately?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So this evening, because Southampton is interested in exploring this idea of creating an affordable housing trust, MHP has been partnering with the Housing Authority in particular to move this effort forward. And we felt like it was appropriate to have a broader kind of 101 overview of what a municipal affordable housing trust is, as well as a bit of a listening session to hear from you, some of your concerns, interests, but also just some Q&A. So I know that Jim said to hold questions until the end. If there's something that is like a clarifying kind of question that would be kind of quick, because sometimes we accidentally use acronyms too often, then for those purposes, I would feel fine with people just jumping in or raising hands, whatever feels most appropriate. But just a brief overview, MHP is a quasi-state agency in Massachusetts focusing on increasing the supply of affordable housing across the state. And we have essentially 4 legs to our stool, 4 key things that we focus on to support affordable housing. One is the community assistance team that Emma and I are part of, and we really are engaged in local communities, trying to build local capacity to support affordable housing. We have a lending team that has lent over $1 billion supporting the creation and preservation of over 22,000 units of affordable housing. Our niche really is supporting affordable rental housing. We have the home ownership team that manages the one mortgage product in the state. It's a unique product just to Massachusetts. It's the most affordable mortgage product in the state for households earning up to 100% of the area at median income. And then we have a newer team that's the Center for Housing Data. And this is a group of folks that collect, analyze, and disperse information to help inform effective housing policy on the local, regional, and state level. So tonight, we're going to talk a little bit about what a municipal affordable housing trust is, a little bit about some operations and best practices, just based on what we've learned by working in a variety of communities across the state. And then we'll touch on the kinds of activities that an affordable housing trust can be engaged in and helping to support fund.
So, where are you staying here?
To get us started, the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust statute is organized under Mass General Law, Chapter 44, Section 55C. It was passed in 2005. And really, after the Community Preservation Act was passed and after many communities establish CPA in their community. It became kind of the impetus to create this enabling legislation for trust, because many communities just didn't have a lot of infrastructure to support affordable housing. So this was considered a tool to help build local infrastructure. It is a public entity, so it's not outside of the community. It is a municipal entity. It's created by your local legislative board with just a majority vote. And the purpose is actually somewhat narrow. It's really to create and preserve affordable housing for low and moderate income households. It's led by a board of trustees that's appointed locally in a town. It's appointed by the select board. And because it is a municipal entity, it's subject to public procurement, designer selection, conflict of interest, and public meeting laws, just like all of your other municipal boards. So it would be helpful if everyone would mute themselves. We're getting a little bit of activity going on at someone's house. So the overall process of establishing a trust, or the simple overview, is first for the community to decide whether you're going to write a bylaw that might add additional guidance to the establishment of your trust, or whether you're just going to accept the statute as it is written. So it depends on the community. Some communities just pass the statute as it is. Some communities write a bylaw. The second is that the legislative body needs to accept the bylaw with a majority vote. The bylaw is then submitted to the AG's office within 30 days, as is similar with the process with your other bylaws. You can then set up, establish a board of trustees. Many communities will record a declaration of trust right away to establish the powers of the trust up front. And that can be a standalone document at the registry. A trust fund account is then set up. This is typically a municipal account. It's typically done through the municipal treasurer. And then the navy blue steps are ones that we suggest that I'm going to get into a little bit tonight. So very broadly, a municipal affordable housing trust can focus on addressing affordable housing needs in the community. This is an entity that can support local control of housing initiatives, and the trust can engage in real estate activity. The trust can buy or sell property. And because the trust doesn't have to go to town meeting, it's different from the Community Preservation Committee in that way. It means that the trust can engage more, can respond more nimbly, particularly in the real estate market. So if there's a parcel that's coming up for sale, or the trust learns about a potential development, the trust can respond typically more quickly than if you had to go through the CPC process, where it has to go through town meeting, excuse me. And then as a municipal entity, the trust can be collecting funds from a variety of sources. And I'll list a variety of different ways that communities are currently funding their trust. So the statute it's a very short statute. It's actually really easy to read through compared to a lot of our statutes. And the requirements are, it's not very prescriptive. So it leaves a lot of room for communities to either also stay really broad in your requirements for the trust board, or to add additional parameters. So the statute just says a minimum of 5 members. It's not a scientific view of this, but my opinion, just from working in so many communities and reading so many bylaws, is that 7 is probably the most common number. Some communities have 9 members, and we have at least a couple communities, Salem and Brookline, that have over 10 members, which is fairly large. But it seems to be the most typical is in my opinion, is about 7 members. The statute says that 1 member must be a member of the select board in a town that's run by a select board. The trustees are appointed by the select board. They're 2-year terms, and many communities stagger those terms so that you never have 100% turnover of members. And the trustees are public agents, just like they're special municipal employees, just like with your other boards. So in some communities, they provide additional parameters. They might, or recommendations. they might specify in a bylaw that they want certain boards to be represented on the trust board, not just the select board, but in some communities, they might want a member of the CPC, for example, to be on the trust, or they might want a member of a housing partnership or a housing committee or a different housing group to have a seat on the board. In some communities, they might suggest that certain skill sets are considered for the board. We suggest that communities not be too prescriptive because we don't want to make it difficult to find appointees down the road. And you don't want to miss out on people who could be really fantastic and are really passionate about affordable housing and the need for affordable housing, but may not have explicit experience in affordable housing or housing development or real estate law. These are the kinds of skills that communities will oftentimes suggest that trustees have experience in. Or some communities might say that 2 positions should be set aside for people who have this kind of experience. But we encourage communities to be more suggestive and less prescriptive, just that you're not restricting yourself over the long term. And you also want to consider that if you're wanting a lot of existing boards to have representation on the trust, that it may be difficult for those members to be really active on the trust board just because of time commitment. And you just want to make sure that you're able to get a quorum, you're able to have members that can be actively engaged. So they're all things to think about up front. The statute lists a variety of different powers that are given to the trust board. We do have communities that might require a 2/3 vote of trustees for certain powers like borrowing funds. There might even be a power where they want the select board to potentially have some input onto a decision that's made. Oftentimes that's around things like borrowing funds. But we do caution communities about being too restrictive because you don't want to take away from one of the key benefits of a trust, and that's flexibility to be able to really respond nimbly in the real estate market. Just want to give one example of how a community has structured their trust. This is the town of Brewster on Cape Cod. They created a municipal affordable housing trust in 2018. They had an existing fund that was just not very flexible, so they dissolved that and they transferred the limited funds, the $80,000 that was in that fund, to this new municipal affordable housing trust fund. They have their bylaw specifies 7 trustees, so there's a member of the select board as required by the trust statute. They actually give a spot to their town administrator or an appointee. So their town administrator has appointed their assistant town administrator. And then they have they require a member of the housing partnership to be appointed to their trust board. They require a member of their CPC and a member of their planning board to be on the trust. So they have 3 additional boards where they require representation on the trust. That's higher than we would typically suggest because it just can be so hard in communities to be calling on the same people, because oftentimes anyone who sits on one board sits on 3 boards in towns. So it's actually more than we would suggest, but for them and the relationships in their community, they felt like this was important for communication and just buy-in from different boards. And then they have 2 spots that are reserved for citizens at large. So this is one of the few communities that I know of that actually has a position that's allocated specifically for a municipal employee, the town administrator. It's fairly uncommon. Beverly is a city where they do have staff, municipal staff on their board, but most communities have all volunteers. However, I think that from watching Brewster have their assistant town administrator on their board, I think it's been really beneficial for them. I think it's been really helpful to have someone who pretty much knows everyone, knows pretty much all the boards, to be a part of communicating across boards, and someone who has just a broad understanding of the community. I think it's actually been really beneficial for them. So it's something that I would keep in mind as a possibility. They started out by developing a mission statement, so really helping to identify what they see their purposes in the community. They created goals with priority initiatives, and then they have had 1 or 2 housing forums to engage the public and to receive feedback from the broader community. And in terms of powers, they did restrict the allocations. So they've decided that allocations over $50,000 were subject to the select board approval. So this is one power that they decided to modify. So shifting a little bit to some best practices and suggestions for how to run a trust. Keys to success it's not rocket science. It's really having some money in the bank. It's having a vision and a clear sense of what the role of the trust is in the community, having leadership people that can help move the efforts of the trust forward, and then transparency, openness in the community. So first, money. What's been really exciting to me and encouraging is that we're seeing communities be more and more creative with finding ways to support affordable housing, and specifically affordable housing trusts. So it is true that about 76% of our housing trust communities also have the Community Preservation Act. So CPA is the most common form of funding for a trust, but it's not a guarantee in every community, and it's not necessarily a regular yearly allocation. It depends on the community. But CPA is clearly one option. Another is inclusionary zoning, IZ. We have several communities that have an inclusionary zoning bylaw that allows an in lieu of payment in some cases where a developer can pay into a fund instead of actually building affordable units. And in some cases, these funds are directed to the Affordable Housing Trust. So Swampscott is an example of that. And Swampscott's bylaw actually allows a trust to create the formula to determine what the in lieu of payment is. We have some communities that have directed free cash or funds from the general fund to their trust. Brookline and Truro are examples of that. We have communities that they may direct income from tax title sales to the trust, or like Chelsea, they're actually transferring some of their tax title properties to their trust to dispose of for affordable housing. We have one community on the Cape that has a cell phone tower, and the income from the lease payments are directed to their trust. It's not a lot of money. It's a little bit of money, but it's a little bit extra that goes to the trust. There may be special bylaws or ordinance payments that could be directed to the trust. We have the first community that we know of that has passed a municipal bond to seed their trust. Medfield created a trust a few years ago, and then also bonded $1 million against they don't have CPA, so they bonded it against their general fund to seed their affordable housing trust. Orleans on the Cape has passed a tax override of $275,000 that is consistent funding for their trust. And because of this income source, they're the only trust that I know of that has been able to access a line of credit with a bank. We have some communities that are using short-term rental fee income. So Gloucester and Brewster are examples of this. And Wellfleet is attempting to advocate for these funds from their community. You likely know that there's legislation right now to establish the ability for any community in the state to pass a real estate transfer fee to support affordable housing. So there are individual bills, Nantucket, Boston, but there's also a statewide bill that's being considered by the legislature. And donations are always a possibility of land or cash. Some communities have talked about income from marijuana tax. I don't know of any yet that have actually designated any of those funds for affordable housing. But the good news is that communities are being more and more creative of finding a variety of ways. And the best strategy is typically having a few different funding sources and not just relying on one. So with a new trust, we really encourage the trustees in collaboration with the community to really work on determining needs in the community. So Southampton has a housing production plan, and we would suggest that trustees start by really reading through that plan, really getting familiar with the identified needs in the community, and then based on those identified needs that have already been done in community, so not reinventing this, but using what materials you already have, then we suggest that the trust take some time to then set priorities for the trust. The housing needs in all of our communities are really significant. The resources are never enough. So take some time. We suggest communities take some time to set priorities about the things that you're going to focus on. And in some communities, it might make sense to create a benchmark if there's a particular dire need that you really want to focus on, just to bring particular attention to that need. We do suggest that trustees create a mission statement. I'm getting a little bit of feedback, so I'm wondering if someone needs to mute themselves. So do encourage trustees to take some time to create a mission statement. I just pulled two off of websites, Brewster's on the left and then Amherst on the right. One thing that I really appreciate about Brewster, and clearly this is a reflection of the environment of being on Cape Cod in an environment that is very centered on the tourist industry, but they're really calling out that they're really focused on year-round affordable housing, and that they really want to help support and foster a welcoming environment for demographically and socio-economically diverse populations. I appreciate that sensitivity of really calling that out. And in Amherst, they are really reminding the community that they're about promoting the town's affordable housing priorities. They're a part of the town. They're not in a silo off on their own. But we encourage new trusts to spend some time creating a mission to help focus the trustees, but also to help the community understand how the trust sees its role in the community. And this can be done with trustees, but we suggest engaging the community, the broader community in this process. And then we suggest doing some kind of planning. And this looks different in different communities. A lot of it can depend on your resources, also just your bandwidth, given on how much planning you've already done. So on the left is Beverly. They created some internal guidelines. They had some staff capacity to help support them in this. And they finished their housing plan. So they're over 10% on the subsidized housing inventory, but they still had a consultant help them update their housing plan. So they had current data about what was happening, the housing needs in their community. And then based on those needs, they determined the eligible activities, the things that they were going to focus on funding, given the needs that were identified in their plan. So they did a little bit less intense kind of process that was in-house. Amherst, on the other hand, hired a consultant, then they did a full 5-year strategic plan. Brewster did a more in-house process where they created some goals and strategies to move forward. So it looks different in different communities, but we do suggest that with every new trust that you take some time to do some initial planning, because what we found in the past is that people will try to jump in and just get started. And so often they end up spinning their wheels because the needs are so great and the resources are limited. So we do suggest some sort of initial planning. And then as you're bringing in a new housing entity, and most communities like your community, you have existing groups that are working on affordable pieces of affordable housing, your housing authority, and you likely have other boards that are doing things here and there. We do suggest a conversation early on between different entities about who's doing what. So this is just Hingham's from their housing plan. They have different strategies on the left, some short-term, middle-term, longer-term, and then on the right, the responsible parties. So we suggest doing this kind of exercise earlier rather than later to keep from stepping on each other's toes, to help with accountability across different boards. And then this kind of work takes teamwork. Affordable housing is complex, it's expensive, it's difficult. So you really need a dedicated chairperson, someone that can help move projects forward. You need trustees that are able to show up and really be engaged. This really needs to be a working board. And then the most successful trusts seem to have some kind of paid staff support. In some communities, this is more administrative, so helping with the logistics of posting meetings, of minutes, of communicating between different boards. Others, it might be more technical. It might be a consultant that's helping with a specific program, or it might be helping to support the trust in considering different potential sites for affordable housing in the community. So it might be a bit more technical. But the most successful trusts tend to have some kind of support. And this is something that the trust can pay for themselves with the funds that they have in their account. but it is something that we consider that we suggest that communities consider early on and upfront. And then we urge communities to be transparent with their affordable housing efforts. We all know that housing development and specifically affordable housing development can be controversial in communities. So we urge trusts to be reporting back to whatever boards you identify as necessary on a regular basis when you're funding different developments or programs, that you promote these efforts, that you use the webpage as a simple, affordable way to communicate what the trust is doing, what your mission statement is, provide a link to the bylaw that established the trust, list who's on the trust, if there's staff support, list that person and how to get in touch with that person. Any links to programs, just don't make it difficult for people to understand what the trust is about and what the trust is engaged in. And then lastly, we have some communities where the Affordable Housing Trust just wants to act more like the Community Preservation Committee, where they just want to have money in their account, review applications for funds, and then decide who they're going to fund. So they just want to be a funder. Other communities really want to be more of an initiator. So during the pandemic, it was actually in many communities, the Affordable Housing Trust that initiated emergency rent assistance, for example. And we're seeing more affordable housing trusts engaged in disposing of municipal land for affordable housing. In some cases, the municipal site is transferred to the trust to then dispose of for affordable housing. In probably more cases, it's the trust that's just actively engaged in the process. So helping with some pre-development work on the site, helping to write the request for proposals, and then reviewing applications. And then we have trusts that want to do advocacy within the community. They want to be a part of advocating for affordable housing and educating the community. And some trusts want to do all of these things. And we just suggest that trustees talk about this early on, and that the trust be clear about how they're going to function, how they're going to operate in the community, and that you be clear or explicit to the community, that you share that with the community, that the community understands how the trust is going to function within the town or the city. So shifting gears to the last section is examples of the kinds of things that an affordable housing trust can fund. And I'm using the verbs of CPA, the Community Preservation Act, because a few years ago, the trust statute was modified so that all of the allowable uses under community housing with CPA are allowable activities for an affordable housing trust. So with CPA, we use the verbs acquire, create, preserve, support. So one example of acquire is this apartment complex in Barnstable, and I believe that it was permitted originally under Chapter 40B. So a portion of the units were affordable, but only about 25%. And in 2011, a nonprofit organization, POA, was able to use local resources, $500,000 of local resources, to leverage additional funds to acquire the entire site. And now almost all of the units are affordable in perpetuity. There were a few units that were occupied by people who were not income qualified, and POA did not want to displace them. So there are a few units that are market rate, but almost all of them are affordable. So a way that local funds can be used to create affordable housing out of existing market rate housing. All of the examples that I'm giving are allowable by a housing trust. Some of them were actually technically funded by the CPC, but they're all activities that a trust could fund. We have a variety of communities, housing trusts that run small scale homeownership programs. So helping income qualified households purchase existing housing units in the community. One not too far from you, Leverett, has a program that their trust established. It's managed by the Regional Housing and Redevelopment Authority. Their maximum purchase price is, I think that this is still current, is $275,000. And they'll provide up to 20% of the sale price or up to $50,000. And the way that they have run this in the past is they'll have essentially vouchers that are worth up to $50,000. And they'll run a lottery to see who's qualified for the program. Their program is actually for households earning up to 100% of the area median income. So that's CPA's limit is 100%, and they've decided to to use that as the ceiling of people for people who are qualified. Because it's 100% of the area median income, it means that none of the units are on the subsidized housing inventory, and the state doesn't engage with units that are 100% of the area median income. So Leverett has their own restriction that they add on these units so that they'll be resold to households earning up to 100% of the area median income. These kinds of programs are somewhat expensive per unit. Most don't add more than just 2 or 3 units a year, but it is a kind of program. They're all structured differently, but it's a kind of program that many communities, many trusts help support and run. And they have an outside consultant or agency actually manage the program for the trustees, who are, of course, volunteers. We have many examples of trusts participating in funding the creation of new affordable housing. And these also are structured in a lot of different ways. This is a development being proposed. It's actually, they're breaking ground on it. Actually, they're breaking, a ribbon cutting in just a week for the first phase. But this is a development in Beverly. It's being developed by a nonprofit, Harbor Light Community Partners. So they're actually a CDC, a community development corporation. The total development will be 77 units, although phase 1 is, I believe it's 38 units. So it's 2 and 3 bedroom units. They have reserved 15 units for homeless families. The people are income qualified if they are earning up to 60% of the area median income. So when you see 60%, you can be guaranteed that there are low income housing tax credits in the deal, because that's the ceiling for LIHTC in Massachusetts. The city actually designated this area as a 40R district, so a smart growth district. It's near transit in this case. And one of the benefits for the community is that at the time of rezoning the area as a 40R district, the state pays the community some funds as an incentive payment for rezoning to allow multifamily housing. And then at the time of occupancy, the community will get additional funds, the city will get additional funds per unit of housing that have been built on this site. Their CPC contributed $250,000, their trust contributed $200,000. So in some communities, the trust is set up where a developer could go to both the CPC for funds and the trust. In other communities like Cambridge, they essentially use their trust as the community housing arm of the CPC. So Cambridge transfers 80% of their CPA funds to their trust every year, and the developers for housing just go to the trust. But in this case, in Beverly, a developer is able to go to both entities. This is a community-driven effort in Westport, so that the town had some municipal site that they were interested in considering for affordable housing. And their trust really helped drive the effort to get them to the point of 50 new units of affordable housing. This just came online, I think it was either right before the pandemic or early on in the pandemic. I think it was right before. So the trust helped with some initial pre-development work. They helped acquire an adjacent site so that there was access to the town site. And then they helped with the releasing of a request for proposals and reviewing proposals. And then once the developer was chosen to build these 50 affordable apartments, the trust also contributed some funds toward the development. So then that meant the developer was able to take those to show that local support for the development to the state and acquire low-income housing tax credits and other resources in order to build this site. So again, it's 60% area median income. That means there's low-income housing tax credits. It's family rental or just non-age restricted rental. Seniors are more than welcome to live in this housing as well. They have 5 of the units that are reserved for households earning up to 100% of the area median income. So we are happily seeing more communities driving affordable housing development on municipal sites. This is an example not too far from you. So a very small community. And I do like to give this example because sometimes small communities feel really overwhelmed, like there's nothing that they can do for affordable housing. It's so hard. But this is, I think, a really awesome story of a very small community that identified a need for affordable housing. They had a committee that was really focused on the needs of seniors And so they really felt like senior housing was an area of need in the community. And it was this committee that really helped to drive the conversation. And they engaged with a local nonprofit that does housing development. They communicated with a church around possible surplus land that the church owned. The nonprofit was then able to use CDAC acquisition loans. So CDAC is a state agency that has some acquisition funds available for nonprofit organizations for the purpose of acquiring land for affordable housing. So this nonprofit was able to acquire this land, and they developed 10 units of senior rental housing, single floor, 1-bedroom units, fully accessible. And the community, because they had recently established the Community Preservation Act in Goshen, they had these resources available. So they directed $130,000 towards these 10 units that are in right near the municipal, I think, town hall, and in a pretty central area. So given how small Goshen is and how few year-round housing units they have in the community, 10 units is actually a substantial contribution in that community. And I think it's just a great example of local initiative and using a modest amount of local funds, $130,000, to create 10 really important units for the community. And then we have many examples across the state of reusing existing buildings, oftentimes underutilized buildings, for affordable housing. Sometimes there's a historic component, but not always. So in Middleborough, the shoe shop place, it actually had been a shoe factory. 2 nonprofit organizations were able to acquire it and redevelop it into 25 units of rental housing. I have family housing, family in quotes, just because it means it's not age restricted, but it's not just families that can live there. Also, single adults, seniors can live there as well. In North Andover, Stevens Corner had been a nursing home that was, I think, had been empty for years. A nonprofit that's actually based in Boston, but a nonprofit acquired it and then was able to receive some local funds to redevelop the site into 42 units of rental housing. Again, non-age restricted housing. I should mention that in Middleborough, they were, their CPA, their CPC was new. They didn't have that many local resources to contribute. So the local contribution was just about $30,000 for these 25 units, but it was still enough for the state to see the local support in the development. And the developers were able to receive low-income housing tax credits and other resources to make the 25 units work. In Stevens Corner, North Andover had more resources. They'd had CPA longer, and their trust had been around for longer. So they received, it was closer to about $1 million on this development. And then in Swampscott, this school, this just recently came online. A nonprofit was able to acquire the school and redevelop it into, this is age restricted, so senior housing in Swampscott. I actually think that it was a municipal, I think it was the municipality had an RFP out, I believe. So oftentimes reusing existing buildings, particularly ones that are underutilized, it is oftentimes a less controversial way to add affordable housing. It can be a great way to solve a couple different issues, add affordable housing, bring a building back online, and beautify the space. Sometimes if there's a historic component and you have CPA, sometimes there might be historic resources, CPA resources, and housing resources that are put into the deal, but certainly not always. And then when we talk about preserve with affordable housing, we are typically talking about the preserving just the affordability. So in many cases, affordable housing has expiring use where the affordability is only for a period of time. This was the case in this development in Amherst, Rolling Green, 204 unit multifamily development. 41 of the units were affordable. And several years ago, they were coming up on the 15-year restriction, so they were set to expire. And the community was nervous about losing these 41 units, just given the housing crisis that they have, the pressures from UMass in particular. So they reached out to MHP, and we started considering different options with them. And they ultimately, because the existing owner at the time was not interested in extending the affordability, he wanted the units to go market rate, for the profit. ultimately what happened is that the community engaged Beacon Communities, a large developer that has extensive experience in the multifamily housing world. They have extensive experience with Chapter 40B, with CPA, and with housing trusts. And they actually negotiated to purchase the development from the previous owner. But it took the community bonding, using CPA to bond $1.25 million. So that was the local contribution to allow these 41 units now to be affordable in perpetuity. So bonding isn't something that a trust could do, because a trust just doesn't have the kind of consistent income where you can plan ahead like you can with CPA. So in this kind of a case, it was really the CPA that needed to step up. But we have many housing trusts that are paying attention to affordable units in their community that have expiring affordability. And we do have trusts that are paying attention to that and that are kind of setting themselves up to be a part of helping to negotiate extending the affordability. So it's one way that a trust can be engaged. And in some cases, the trust may have enough resources where they can be the one contributing the resources. In others, it might be a partnership with the CPC. You need to be a partnership with the CPC. And then under CPA, there's the support verb, and what has long been considered possibilities under support is pre-development work on municipal sites. So if you do have some municipal sites that you think might be good locations for affordable housing, you could potentially, the trust could potentially use some resources, whether it's CPA resources or other resources that the trust has, to do some initial pre-development work to help contribute to writing a request for proposals that's more in-depth, that has more detail, so that you can better guarantee getting really good proposals from developers. The funds could be used to update your housing plans. And explicitly in the CPA statute under support is rental assistance. So as I said, many trusts use their resources, CPA or otherwise, to support emergency rent assistance particularly in the first year of the pandemic. So just to kind of wrap up, to move us into Q&A and listening session to hear your thoughts. I always suggest that communities really look at your local infrastructure, your needs and your resources, and to make sure that the creation of a housing trust is really helping to fill a niche, that it won't be duplicative, but that it really has, that you really have needs that are not fully being identified that a trust could really focus on. And that the trust come up with goals that really reflect identified needs, not just based on hearsay or assumptions or what would be the easiest within the community, but really, we really urge the trust to work on things and to fund efforts that are really reflective of needs that came out of your housing plan. And then as a volunteer board, to be real about your capacity. Again, I think I've said this 2 or 3 times already, the housing needs in all of our communities are really significant. The capacity of a local board and the resources are just not enough. So we really urge communities to focus on perhaps a few things, 2 or 3 things, and do those well, instead of trying to spread yourself too thin. We have all kinds of online materials to support you, from our Housing Trust Guidebook. We have DataTown, which is a website that gives you data points, critical data points for all 351 communities in the state. There's also the ability to compare different communities just to see how your town lines up with other communities. We have the Housing Toolbox, and the Housing Toolbox has a search tool. So it has a variety of information about housing development, about affordable housing trust, CPA. We have a lot of trainings that are also online. So there are a lot of different resources there. And then you should always see me and Emma. I should have put Emma's information on there. I'm so very sorry, Emma. But you should always see us as resources. You can email us, call us if you have any additional questions. We want to be here to support your efforts. So I know that was a lot. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And then just open it up to Jim to facilitate any questions or conversation.
Well, thanks, Shelley. That was extremely comprehensive, but interesting. And, I guess I'm hoping that we'll have a copy of these slides available for folks, because I think there was a lot of information there to try to internalize. But I do appreciate, Shelley, you sharing, and Emma, I'm sure you're also going to offer expertise as we, questions begin. So I'll open the floor to folks who have questions.
I have a question, John Sheehan. Thanks, Shelley. That was a very comprehensive, big picture of what's happening. I had no idea that so many communities were already into this and seem to be doing a great job. Just to get a feeling for what we're dealing with in Southampton, we have about 2%, I think less than 2% of Southampton is affordable housing. So we have a long way to go. And I was just wondering if you could give us a couple of stats. Like, I know it's based on median income, correct?
What do you mean is what is based on a median income?
To qualify for affordable housing. So what's the median income for Massachusetts?
So it would be based on your region, your community. So I don't know offhand what that is, but it probably is in your housing production plan. So perhaps that can be, too bad we don't have the chat, we could put the link in it there, but maybe the Housing Authority could make sure that you have a link to that folks on this call have a link to that. But I'm pretty sure that your housing production plan outlines what that is for your community. And one thing that I should have said is that the Municipal Affordable Housing Trust statute actually doesn't define low and moderate income. It says that the purpose is to support housing for low and moderate income households, but it doesn't define low and moderate income. So we encourage communities to define that for yourself upfront. In some communities, and we suggest that you use existing definitions of low and moderate income. So in some communities, they want everything that their trust supports to be able to qualify for the subsidized housing inventory. So they might set a ceiling of 80% of the area at median income. In other communities like Leverett, they are looking at up to 100% of the area at median income, which is how CPA defines moderate income. The state has an affordable housing trust that's administered by Mass Housing, and they define moderate income as up to 110% of the area median income. So we would suggest first that you do define what area median income you want the trust to focus on in your community. And then the actual, the income that actually translates into is specific to your region. And I believe that is outlined in your housing production plan.
Yeah, I'm sorry, just wanted to point out, the reason I'm concerned is I know affordable housing is different than low income housing, right?
It's actually basically the same thing. It's basically the same thing. It's just that in different eras, we call it different things. So we used to call it more affordable housing. Now we used to call it more low income housing. Now we call it affordable housing. But you just need to define it for your community of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And just to interject, Shelley, because I see there's some questions, but before we get there, I just want to clarify. So as far as 40B is concerned, I mean, there's certain requirements, right? I think it's a maximum of 80% of the area median income, or AMI, to count toward the housing affordable inventory in town.
Yes.
Am I correct with that?
So with 40B, it's either 25% of the units need to be affordable at 80% of the area at median income, or 20% of the units need to be affordable at, I think it's 50% of the area at median income. The majority of 40B is set at 80% of the area median income. And to be on for any other units to count on the subsidized housing inventory, it needs to be, the ceiling is 80% of the area at median income. So in some of the developments where it was, actually, a lot of the developments, except for ones where it was specifically zoned, like the 40R district, and that wasn't using 40B. But in some of the developments, I believe Westport, the nonprofit, I believe they had to use Chapter 40B to permit. But regardless of how it's permitted, that the units to be on the subsidized housing inventory, they have to be affordable at no more than 80% of the area at median income.
And John, just one further clarification before we move on is Southampton is part of the area median income we're part of is based on the Springfield area. And I don't know what that figure is, but we're part of this Springfield area median income rate.
And see, what my worry, I don't want to extend this, I want to give others an opportunity, but housing costs here have been skyrocketing. And I mean, what probably was considered affordable 10 years ago, this units selling $500,000 to $1 million, which probably were called affordable housing 10 and 20 years ago. It's just out of reach. So I'm just looking at ordinary working people with 1 or 2 incomes. We're not attracting them in Southampton. In fact, we've lost some people. We know some people who have moved out of Southampton because it's not affordable for them.
Thank you. Yeah, the Housing Authority has recognized that in addition to, what 40B Massachusetts defines as affordable, there's the reality that there's a whole continuum of price points. And Southampton is definitely, you just look at the market, it's leading toward the higher end of that continuum.
Yeah.
But I want to give some other folks an opportunity. And I do appreciate, if you're technically skilled, the use of hand raising with the electronic hand raise, that helps. And I don't know if it was Rini or Todd who was first. So I'm just going to pick Todd. Sorry about that.
Well,
but
I
Todd,
think Rini was first, and I'm happy to wait. So go ahead, Rini.
thank you.
You're welcome.
All right, thank you. I just had a question. Thanks for all this information, by the way. An example that you gave of the community that voted to give 80% of their CPC funds to the trust. We know that CPC is a rotating committee based on membership in other committees, and it also has to be allocated at town meeting. Does that require an annual vote by CPC and also an annual vote by town meeting to have those funds be allocated every year?
Yeah, so the example that example is Cambridge. So as a city, it goes before the city council. But in Cambridge, it's when the CPC has their annual hearing, that kind of public hearing, it's the housing people that really come out in force. And they've just decided as a city, because of the cost of housing being so expensive in Cambridge, they have every year transferred 80% to their trust. And then it is a decision that has to go before, that allocation has to go before the city council in that case. So in a town, it would have to go to town meeting, and it would have to be on a yearly basis. It's just that in some communities, they don't require, the CPC doesn't require the trust to actually file an application. It's that the CPC just decides to suggest a certain amount, whether it's 10% or whatever it might be, on a yearly basis. So they just list it as one of their suggestions that then goes, I think, to the select board and then to town meeting. In other communities, the CPC requires the trust to file an application with the CPC. And in some communities, the CPC is willing to accept applications that are more broad, like it's the trust is asking for $300,000 or $500,000 to use for CPA eligible activities, but not necessarily a specific project or development. In other communities, the CPC really wants the trust to apply for funds for a specific purpose. So it depends on the community. It depends on the relationship between the trust and the CPC. We encourage CPCs and trusts to start communication really early and to be really open and to be fluid around expectations. And partly why we urge trusts to do some kind of planning initially is that there's just better accountability, not only for the trust, but also for in having communication with the CPC, so that the CPC has an idea of how does the trust see its role in the community? What does the trust want to be engaged with? And so that it's not just transferring funds, but that there's really a conversation about how will those funds be used, and that there's constant feedback to the CPC as well. That was kind of a long response. Sorry.
Yeah, thank you.
But one other thing, because we do have CPC folks here, one other thing I'll throw out is that the The trust statute requires that the trust be reporting back to the CPC on an annual basis about how the trust is using CPA funds, because we want the CPC to be reporting to the state in the CP3 report every September how CPA funds are being spent by trusts. Because what has happened is that funds have been transferred to trusts, and then we just don't have any idea in a lot of cases how those funds are ultimately being used. And so it's hard to tell the CPA story when we don't gather that data appropriately. So the trust needs to be reporting back to the CPC on a yearly basis about how they're using CPA funds, so the CPC can then be reporting to the state, so that we as a broader CPA community in the state have the right story, a more complete story to tell about how CPA housing funds are being used. And we've created a fillable form to help facilitate this with the trust, to make it really easy. It's all the questions that are asked on the CP3. So we've created it with Stuart, with the state CPC, to help facilitate, make it an easier process for the trust.
Does that answer your questions, Rini?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Okay, Mr. Barron, thank you for.
Hi, how are you, Jim?
Good.
Nice to see you. And Sierra, thank you for inviting me. I have two questions. They both have to do with implications. And the first is, what is the significance of creating affordable housing that is not able to be registered on the state's subsidized housing inventory? That's the first question.
So I'll start with that one. So it really is just a preference of the community, and I would say a reflection of your identified housing needs. So if your housing production plan identifies a need for housing affordable for people earning up to 100% of the area median income, then that could be a justifiable focus and investment for the trust. If your housing production plan really shows that it's people earning under 80%, in a lot of cases, it's people earning under 60% of the area median income that really are the most cost burdened, then it might not make sense to invest in 100% AMI housing. If you're doing a homeownership program, it could make sense to do 100%, because sometimes to access homeownership, you need a little bit more resources. So maybe that makes sense. So I think it just depends on what your housing production plan says, the needs that are identified, and the kinds of programs that you're thinking about. So homeownership, maybe that makes sense. Rental, maybe it's focusing on lower income.
How does this affect the eligibility for state and federal programs? Because it seems, as we did our research for an affordable housing development in Southampton, we found that there were definitely more attractive and available options if we kept at the 80% or less level, which of course made it really difficult to create units that we could even afford to build and meet that 80% level.
So the state, so it depends a little bit. So if it's homeownership, that is definitely much more difficult to fund at any kind of affordability, because the state just isn't putting as much money into homeownership, some, but not as much.
Right.
So rental housing is definitely there are more resources for rental housing. In most cases, the affordable housing is going to be affordable for households earning less than 80% of the area median income, because low-income housing tax credits is the most important funding source, and that's 80%, a 60% ceiling. And even in that, the state requires that some of the units are affordable for 30% of the area median income. So most affordable housing, where it's 100% affordable housing, it's going to be 60%. That's going to be. And there might be a few units, like the Westport example, where 5 were affordable at 100% of the area median income, because they had some CPA funds in the deal as well. We do have some developments where there might be a variety of price points. So there might be 30%, 60%, 80%. There might be 110%, a few units that are at 110%. So there are some resources and there are some examples, but there aren't very many. Typically, when we're talking about multifamily affordable housing. It's not that there are affordable units and market rate outside of traditional Chapter 40B developments where 25% are affordable and 75% are market rate. So I don't know if that helps answer it a little bit, but there aren't very many resources for developments that are 100% are fully 100% AMI or 110 or 120% AMI. It typically has to have many of the units to be deeper affordability, just because of needing to piece together so many different funding sources.
Yes. Okay. And the second question is you've referred to the relationship between the Affordable Housing Trust and the CPC or CPC committee, presumably, correct?
Yes.
And if I'm drawing a correct inference here, it is that there does not have to be a formal relationship between the Affordable Housing Trust and the CPC. Is that correct? In other words, it's not, if the Affordable Housing Trust was not to use any money from CPC, it therefore would not have any reporting responsibility. Is that right?
Right.
It'd be unrealistic, presumably, but I'm just really interested in that relationship because the two are not always operating under the same strategic goals.
Okay, so we do, when a trust comes on board, we do suggest that there be communication between the boards early, just to kind of understand how they're going to communicate, how they're going to, and if they're going to work together. So we do suggest that. There's no requirement that it be a formal relationship. Certainly if CPA funds are transferred to the trust, then the CPC would do a grant agreement with the trust, just like we would suggest a grant agreement with any other allocation. And in that grant agreement, you would establish generally what the funds are for, or if it's specific, the CPC, just like with any other allocation, we would suggest that there be some language around the funds come back to the CPC if they're not spent in a certain amount of time, or if something falls through, whatever, that you would use this, you would treat it similarly because it's the CPA funds. So we want to make sure that they're used for CPA allocated resources. You don't have to have a formal relationship, but we do suggest the conversations start early and that there be openness about expectations. And if the CPC wants to have more than just a CP3 kind of reporting, if you want to have a report annually about how the trust is meeting its goals or progressing through its strategies, then all that should be, I think, should be articulated early, and that there should be openness about kind of expectations. But it's not required. It doesn't have to be formal, other than if there is a grant agreement.
Okay, thank you.
Does that satisfy your questions?
Yes, I have others, but I don't want to, I'm going to call you, Jim, or I'll call Sierra.
Or we'll loop back around here. We have till 8 o'clock. So we'll see. I see, Janet, you have your hand up, but before we go to Janet, I just want to make sure that there's folks who maybe don't know how to use the electronic hand raising and may have a question. I'd like to give those folks an opportunity before we go to Janet.
Jim, I would just like to address the median family income question, if I could.
Okay.
Because I questioned before John has to leave, because I know he has to leave earlier. We did have a handout at the annual town meeting that we shared from the Housing Authority that stated the Springfield, Mass family median revenue, or the median family income, was $91,225. So if you take 80% of that, you're just over 72,000. Take 60% of that, it's around 55,000. Just to address that for John. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Janet. I have those stats right at handy. I love it. Additional questions? Rini, you still have your hand up, but I don't know if that's for a repeat or from your first set of questions.
That was from before. I'll put it down.
Okay. All right. Seeing none, Janet, do you have a question or is your hand still up from last time?
No, it was down, it's back up. So real quick question. First of all, I do want to thank people from CPC and the Council on Aging and the Select Board and the other various committees, zoning board that are on this call. Thank you so much for joining us. My question to Shelley is, do members of the trustees, do the trustees have to be residents of the town? If somebody comes in with a qualification that actually lives outside the town, or is that bylaw driven?
It's bylaw driven. So we do have some communities where they allow, like Chelsea allows people who are not residents to sit on their board. Some might say that a couple seats could be non-residents, but the majority are residents. And then other communities specify that they want just residents on the board. So it's the choice of the local community.
Excellent. Okay. Todd.
Yeah, this is just a strategy question for Shelley. Can you talk about your experience with private development money coming in to help affordable housing trusts? And has it worked, or do you have examples? What recommendations do you have?
So do you mean private money that's donated to a trust?
No, I mean partnership opportunities, if at all possible, between private developers and the work of affordable housing trusts.
So where it's a private developer that's wanting to build affordable housing.
Yes, and is interested in working with the town and the Affordable Housing Trust.
So there are many developers that are not nonprofit, that are for-profit developers that focus on affordable housing. We have many private developers or for-profit developers that respond to municipal requests for proposals to build affordable housing on municipal sites. We have examples of private developers who acquire a site and then work with the community to build affordable housing. Oftentimes that's permitted under Chapter 40B just because so many of our communities don't have zoning that allows for multifamily housing outside of 40B. Sometimes it's a special permit. It might be in an area where there's a special permit and they work collaboratively with the community. So there are many examples of for-profit developers, not just nonprofit, but for-profit developers also building affordable housing and applying to either the CPC or the trust for resources to then also apply for low-income housing tax credits with the state. So there are many for-profit developers that are in this line as well, not just nonprofit. I think the examples that I gave just happen to be nonprofits, but we have multiple for-profit developers that are in the same space.
Thank you.
Yep.
Rini, is that a new hand up?
Yes, it is. I just wanted to ask a question about something that Shelley just said. And I also and this is more of an opinion question. I'm just aware that CPC, I think we had a citizen petition to potentially reduce the CPC amount from 3%, maybe down to 1%. So it's not always 100% supported, although I think there's general support for it. I'm just wondering, when you mention about the membership on the trust and having out-of-town residents, given that the CPC is a huge funder of housing, if you think that there's any disadvantage, given that, you know, it's a surcharge on people's taxes, is there any disadvantage to having outside residents on the trust?
I think that really is just going to need to be a local conversation and decision. That there could be, I think there could be advantages to not restricting outside people from being on the trust. But I just think that that's a local decision that you need to flush out. I know that's probably not very helpful, but so like I said, maybe if it feels like it might be controversial or uncomfortable for people to allow an unlimited number of people outside the community to be on the trust, perhaps a compromise could be that up to 2 people, or 1 or 2, whatever, up to 2 people can be non-residents. but a lot of communities just limit it to residents. So I think it's a trade-off. Like if there's certain expertise that you might be able to access from someone in another community, and you want that kind of expertise or experience on the trust, then I think it could be beneficial to allow that. If you don't really feel like that's necessarily something that you'd be interested in, then I would say that most communities restrict it to residents. And, you know, I live in Boston, and there are plenty of people that don't live in Boston that are engaged in Boston. So it's a different kind of world in other communities. So I think you just need to consider the culture in your community and kind of expectations and perhaps what's happening on other boards, and not make it too different on the trust.
Did that answer
Thank
your
you.
question? Yeah. Okay. Madam Select Chair Fowles. Chris, you have a question.
Thanks, Jim. I'm actually speaking with a different hat tonight. Sorry. Shelley, just wondering if, in your experience, you've heard of towns that have had to present their housing bylaws to the voters and at a town meeting, and any obstacles that they may have run into that they weren't expecting. And secondly, do you have perhaps some towns that you'd recommend that have got some good bylaws that we would want to try to model ours after? Thanks.
So we definitely have communities that struggle at town meeting with their proposal for a trust. Unfortunately, we had one not too long ago, Stoughton. It ended up failing at town meeting. I think that they may have been surprised by some of the anti-reaction or concern that came out at town meeting. I don't think that they were anticipating it. So we definitely have seen some communities get tripped up at town meeting. Most, in at least the last few years, have been wildly successful. I think that particularly in the pandemic, that more and more people in more communities are understanding that our housing needs are acute, and it seems as if there's more openness to consider ways to kind of build a local capacity to support affordable housing. So most of them that we've seen recently have passed and without much issue. However, I do think that there needs to be appropriate conversation beforehand, and working with different boards and education beforehand, which we're trying to do. We're trying to support the Housing Authority in this. And that I do think that key leadership needs to be on board with supporting building the community's local infrastructure to do more affordable housing, to support affordable housing. And if you don't have key leaders on board, then it's just really difficult to even if you were able to get it through town meeting, it can just be difficult for the trust to be able to do anything if leadership isn't on board. So I think all that stuff needs to happen beforehand. I think it's better to have that happen before getting to town meeting, so you're a little bit more aware of what's going to happen at town meeting. And what was the second part of the question that you?
Just any town or two that you think have got some pretty good bylaws that we might use as an example.
Right. So we have started some of that with a small subset of the Housing Authority. A few people, we've started looking at that. Janet and Joy are a couple, and Sierra actually. And there are many of them out there that absolutely we could point you to. I just would point out that we don't hold up any few that we think are particularly exceptional. Most of them just start with the statute, and then they add or they modify to make it fit more with how local boards are developed. So they kind of standardize it for the local community, and the local community then decides on things like, do you want to specify a certain number of trustees? So do you want to say 7 and not just the minimum of 5? Do you want to specify that certain boards should be represented on the trust? Like, these are things that you need to flesh out locally. And so when you go through different bylaws and ordinances, you'll see it's kind of all across the board that different communities just interpret it, decide to do it differently. Sometimes you'll see that some communities seem to be kind of going off the same bylaw or ordinances, but it really is all across the board of how communities structure these. So yes, we can point you to a lot of different options, but we would just suggest that you think it through based on kind of the culture in Southampton, kind of the expectations, some of the power dynamics, to think through some of these details.
Does that answer your questions, Chris? Okay. Janet, you have your hand raised.
I see a theme. Now, I received a question in writing from someone that was on earlier, but probably had to leave before the question and answers came up. So I wanted to share a question from Jim Palermo. His question was, would having sewers facilitate the construction of multifamily buildings in town?
I'm so sorry. Do you mind repeating that? I'm so sorry.
Sorry. Now, his question was, would having sewers, because as you probably know from our discussions, we're mostly septic in town, except kind of the ends of Route 10. Would having sewers facilitate the construction of multifamily buildings? Or is that not been a preventative?
Well, it definitely, having access to sewer can simplify multifamily housing. That is definitely true. But we have many examples of affordable housing, multifamily affordable housing being built in communities without access to sewer. And we actually just in our Housing Institute a week or two ago, we had a fantastic presentation that really went through this and showed how multifamily affordable housing can be built without sewer. And we'd love to send you the link to that. So people can watch that if they're interested. So definitely having access to sewer simplifies it. But so many examples across the state of multifamily affordable housing have happened without sewer.
Thank you.
Yeah, we'd love to see that link, please.
Yes.
Yeah, I wish we had the chat. I wish we had the chat here because we could just put it right in the chat, the link to it.
I'm really frustrated with the lack of chat, but
That may be a first.
yeah. Good. Okay. I really want to give a chance for some folks who have yet to ask a question. It's your opportunity to ask. We're coming up on the top of the hour, but 10 minutes is a long time to flesh out some questions.
I'll say something. I really thought that I had questions that are not related to the presentation from Shelley. And so I really think it's at the Housing Authority board level. And so I didn't want to take time away from the focus of her role, and because she has a lot of information and I've heard her before and I've been in and out, so I have an inconsistent pattern in terms of putting all the pieces together. And I have a lot of questions. So in the interest of time, I will go to the chair first and kind of give him an idea. And then maybe I could be invited to a meeting and kind of do it from the Housing Authority board. And I'm sure Shelley will make an appearance in the future.
That is fine. I just want to say that all of our Housing Authority meetings are public, and so we offered, we always offer at the beginning of the meeting, time for the public. It's one of our agenda right up front. So you're always welcome to come.
Well, how much time do I have? 5 minutes or 10? Because I know
if you have many questions, maybe what we could do is we could make, to your point, an agenda item for you, so that we can get to the business at hand and then and focus on your questions and give it the respect.
The one thing too that moved me most recently was the fact that I don't remember who it was, and it was a meeting that there was some discussion about going to a special town meeting for something. I don't know if it was funding or moving ahead on this project. So I thought, gee, from what I've seen, there's so many components, and even you, Jim, have said there's a lot to learn. We're kind of navigating through this. And so I thought that was sort of it was a surprise that you were at the stage and I don't know, maybe it was you, Janet, I can't remember. Somebody said something about having something ready for a special town meeting. And so that's what brought me here tonight, but I have watched some of the meetings. I just haven't logged in.
Well, I'm welcome to hear from you directly if you want to like arrange for to be an
I'll give you
agenda
an
item.
idea. I'll give you an idea. And
Okay.
but I did take some notes, and CPC and CPA and all those,
Okay.
their roles. So I will, and also Virginia in terms of her role in terms of the funding, the housing specific amounts of money that are designated for housing
Okay.
allocation, right?
Okay. So, Ms. Cohen, what I'm going to suggest, because you're right, we want to make sure we give time tonight for the topic for tonight, is you can email me
Okay.
or reach out to me and we can have the discussion and we can move forward with your questions. I think you're correct, more in the venue under the aegis of the Housing Authority.
Okay.
Specifically.
Thank you.
I do appreciate your interest. Absolutely. And I don't claim that I or even the Housing Authority will have all the answers. We're doing our
Well,
best. Yeah,
that's why we contribute. We have an opportunity to have a conversation.
exactly. Exactly. Thank you. So again, I do want to encourage folks to ask questions. It's not like questions cannot be answered after tonight, but we have an opportunity here. We have two experts from MHP with us who can give a lot of good information, already have. So I feel like it's a real opportunity for folks to put questions based on the topic tonight. Yes, sir.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can.
Yeah, I'm Hank Barton. I was chair of the Housing Authority some years ago, chair of the Master Plan Committee, and I promoted Housing Trust while I was on the Housing Authority and got no place with it. But I think it is something that would allow you to get faster results with fewer political issues if you can get it established, if you can get past the first vote. So if you don't mind a non-resident weighing in on this.
Well, Mr. Barton, it's nice to meet you, even though it's virtually. I have seen your name in the previous minutes and notes, and I've read your work. So thank you for your past investment. And what I'm hearing is an endorsement to move forward with the Housing Trust based on your experience. Appreciate that.
So I also would like to just point out that an advantage of a trust, because I know that you have CPA, an advantage is that while the CPC members are focused on 4 different categories and affordable housing is just one of those categories. So the CPC members have to become more and more fluent in historic preservation, open space, recreation, and affordable housing. And these, again, are volunteers. And oftentimes our CPCs in many communities only have one housing person out of the, how many are on it? At least 5, and some communities have more. So oftentimes there's only one housing voice on the CPC. And yet affordable housing is really complex. Having a trust means that you have a group of people where their sole focus is affordable housing. So it can just help build your capacity to focus on the affordable housing needs in your community.
Yeah, we do have our CPC chair here, Virginia. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, but are you willing? You have a lot of experience as chair of that group. And we appreciate your expertise, but what Shelley is saying, I think rings true. I see you nodding your head.
You're muted.
Yeah, you're still muted, unfortunately. Curse the technology, I say.
Check the bottom left of your screen, Virginia, where there's a microphone.
Yeah.
Click.
I wonder if I can, Janet, actually, are you the host? Can you unmute her?
You're muted too, Janet.
I can ask her to unmute, but I can't
Yeah,
unmute her. So
yeah.
There she goes.
There you go. We got you.
Okay, what was the question?
So it's not a question. It's just, I don't know if affirmation is the right word, but there's been a lot of talk about how the CPC plays a role in all of this. And I was saying that you have a lot of experience in the CPC and as chair, and I don't believe, I can't speak for you, I want you to speak for you, but I don't think Shelley is saying anything that you don't already know, that there's a level of complexity and the CPC has a close role with this.
Yes, we've always had, because they mandate a person from the housing authority on the CPC. And I know they've worked, some of them have worked diligently, and trying to get things moved forward. And yes, we have money, and we just saw an example of what happens without a trust, that piece of property came up for sale. And we voted the money, but we then had to go to the annual town meeting. And there was a lag there.
Mm-hmm.
And I was holding my breath, hoping that nobody else came along and waved some money at the owner. And so I don't see in Southampton that there would be dissension between a housing board and the community preservation. I think they would work together and hopefully be able to move things forward, because there's still a large amount of money sitting there, which has accumulated for over 20 years.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And we've hoped for someone, and we've had some people that were more active than others in trying to get something going. So I think this is a wonderful opportunity. There's certainly not going to be any problem. Your person from your housing authority or the housing board has been active and coming and telling us what's going on and keeping us up to date.
Yes, Sierra Simmons, she's been great. Yes.
Yes.
Want to commend her. She's with us tonight. She's just not showing. There you are.
Yeah, so I agree that we really need to, and I think the CPC as a whole board will support moving this forward and maybe even taking part in some of the discussions.
Sorry about that, folks. Thank you, Virginia. I'm noticing we are at the top of the hour, and I'm not seeing any additional hands, so I think it's an opportunity to end our program tonight. Again, I want to echo Janet's thoughts. I thank everyone who's come tonight. We have a lot of folks from town, from various boards, citizens, interested citizens, our two guests from MHP. It's really been a great effort tonight. I've learned a lot. I continue to learn. I'm hoping I can keep it all in this head, but a lot of good folks to help. It's just has been a very good evening, and I think it's a reflection on you folks who've shown up tonight. I appreciate it. I want to thank you all for coming, and I wish you all a good evening.
Keep up the
Thank
good
you.
work.
Thank you very much.
Good night.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Good night.